Hey guys, it's Kevin again. Welcome to the next video in this series as we're talking about critical race theory and how that relates to the progressive Christian church. And so what I want to do for this video, this is not going to be the most fun video of all of them, but we're going to talk about the problem. What is the problem that America has as far as racism between white people and black people, for example? What does our history look like? So we're going to talk about some things in our past that aren't necessarily the best things about American history. I am proud to be an American. I think this is one of the greatest countries on the planet, and I'm proud of the way that we fought our revolution. We declared our independence, our Constitution, our liberties. Certainly am proud to be an American. However, there are things in America's past that were wrong, and it's not something that we should shy away from. It's something that we need to declare as evil, as wrong, as a sin, and we should study our history and see study it in a way where we just don't look at the good parts and ignore the bad parts, but we look at all of it. And so that's what we're going to do today for this video. It's not going to be the most warm and fuzzy video, but it's important because we want to talk about the context, because out of this context, this is the problem. Critical race theory is the one that says, all right, we have a solution to the problem. So if we want to talk about is critical race theory biblical or not, we really need to understand the context to this. And so that's what we're going to do here. So history of racism in America. Has there been racism in America? Is there racism today? Has there ever been? So let's talk about that right now. So first of all, we want to talk about race versus ethnicity. And this is going to be a pretty controversial thing to say, but race is not really something that is genetic. Race is more of a social construct of how we group people together based on one criteria, and that's the color of their skin. It's not necessarily a genetic thing, but when we look at an ethnicity, we're talking about something that is genetic. We're talking about where people have come from and their culture and their upbringing and their language and the part of the world that they live in and their heritage and all that stuff. The Bible talks about ethnicities and different cultures and different people groups all across the world, and sometimes the conflict that different groups have with each other. But that's ethnicity, and that is certainly something that's real and can be looked at as far as genetically. But race is something that is more a man-made thing. It is more like, we're going to say that all the white people who have this color skin, and they belong to this group. All people who have dark skin, they belong to this group. And so it's more of a social construct than anything. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that race is unimportant. Race is certainly very important. When we look at other people, we see the color of their skin, and we might automatically have a bias for or against that skin color. And so race is something that we do need to acknowledge that it is there. It does have an impact on our society. But I would argue that there's only one race, that's the human race, but we do have multiple ethnicities, and we can talk about the differences between those. Now, race in America has a pretty bad past, because if we go all the way back to 1619, we have the very beginnings of slavery in America. There's something called the 1619 Project. You've probably heard of it. It's very controversial research, study, explanation of events of America's history. There was slavery in America before 1619, but this was really a big pivotal year as far as the institution of slavery in our country. This is when the very first African slaves, they come from Africa and arrived in Virginia and the colonies. And this is really a big part of the beginning of slavery in the colonies and ultimately the United States of America. Now, I don't think there's any denying that the transatlantic slave trade was just evil. It's just wrong. It's just completely unbiblical, antithetical to the gospel, just wrong. And I think we should call it that. It is evil. When people would go to Africa and kidnap people and take them out of their country, out of their home, out of their culture, their family, their friends, just straight up kidnap them, which is against the Bible, by the way. It's against the Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament to be kidnapping people. So that's wrong. And then throw them on a boat and sell them across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, in the 1600s, it's pretty hard to go across the Atlantic Ocean, and a lot of people did die. Up to a quarter or maybe even a third of these people who were kidnapped perished on the way to the colonies. And when they did get to the colonies, then they had a lifetime of bondage and slavery, and they had to work for someone else their entire life. Not only that, when they had kids, their kids would be born into slavery, and they would be a slave their entire life. And just slavery was evil. It was wrong. It was not biblical. There were a lot of Christians who were against slavery during this time, and a lot of people praying for it to end. It would end after the Civil War with the 14th Amendment. But between 1619 and after the Civil War, there was certainly a lot of disparity between white people and black people in America and in the colonies. One of the most famous Supreme Court decisions before the Civil War was the Dred Scott decision. And Dred Scott decision was about a slave who was in the South, and he made his way to a northern state, which was a free state. And the whole idea was, does the slave become free when he goes to a free state, since they don't have slavery there? And the Supreme Court come back and said, no, he doesn't have any rights because he is a slave and he doesn't deserve any rights that a white person doesn't think he deserves. And so essentially he had to stay a slave even though he was in a free state. And not only that, the Supreme Court come back and said, look, the only people who can be naturalized citizens of the United States of America are white people. If you are dark-skinned, it doesn't matter if you're free or a slave, you cannot become a naturalized citizen. And so you see this bias, and this is not just like some random person on Facebook who is just like, spouting off a bunch of racist stuff about black and white people. This is the Supreme Court. This is the highest court in the land coming up with these decisions. Now, when we get through the Civil War, after the Civil War is over and we have Reconstruction, we have the constitutional amendment of the 14th Amendment, where this takes slavery and abolishes it. Slavery is no longer legal. And not only that, black people are allowed to become citizens of the United States. So this was a great moment in American history where we said that the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness applied to all people, not just white people. And that's a great amendment that we have. I pray that one day we're going to have another constitutional amendment that's going to expand that even more, that we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, no matter how small or how vulnerable that life is, whether that life is inside the womb or outside the womb. All life is precious and deserves that right to life. And so I pray that one day we'll have another constitutional amendment in this country, and I'm praying for that, fighting for that, and hope that we'll have that one day. But just because the constitutional amendment of the 14th Amendment and it ended slavery, it doesn't mean that all racism was gone, all bias was gone, all disparities between whites and blacks were gone. No, that's not true at all, because after the constitutional amendment was passed, you had these other laws that were being passed not only by the Supreme Court of the United States, but also local jurisdictions and local states and cities and parts of the country who were trying to get around this non-slavery issue. So you had things called the Black Codes. The Black Codes were essentially these laws that said if a black person is in prison, they can serve their sentence by being taken out of the prison and put in on a plantation and essentially work for an owner to pay off their sentence. And so they would be going back into slavery if they were arrested, and they could be taken out of prison and be back into slavery. Then you have like Plessy versus Ferguson, another big court ruling talking about separate but equal. And so that's, we have different schools and segregated schools. So black people can go to one school, white people can go to the other school, but you can't mingle them together. Different water fountains, different restaurants, all that, different parts of town, etc. And so you have that disparity as well. And then you have the Jim Crow laws that you all know about as well. And this goes all the way up to the 1960s in the civil rights movement. So you have all of these biases. You also have biases in court cases. A lot of times the judge or the jury would make decisions based on the race of the defendant. And you would have it'd get kind of complicated though, because sometimes you'd have someone who wasn't 100% black. Maybe they were just like, they had a mixed race parents, and maybe they were only like 1/8 black. Well, what do you do in that case? And so the court would have to determine how black are you. And if you are too black, then you get this sentence, and if you're whiter skin, you get this sentence. So we did have in some court cases there was a lot of bias, a lot of issues of that, and so you see these disparities between black people and white people all in our history in the United States. Now you're going to say, well, what does that matter today? We don't have slavery today. We don't have Jim Crow today. We don't have the black codes. All of that stuff is gone. So there's no racism today. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that there are ripple effects today that are straight from all of these actions that happened in our history. For example, let me just give you one example. After the Constitutional Amendment, 14th Amendment passed, slavery is illegal, and you have blacks are starting to have more rights and stuff like that. A lot of banks and creditors, they would not give black people the right to open up a loan for a house, and it was in the law for them to do that. It wasn't against the law for them to do that. They could say that we're going to deny your right to a mortgage because you're black, and that happened to some families, and some families didn't have the ability to buy a house, even though there was nothing wrong with their record or their credit score or anything like that. They weren't able to buy a house, and they had to rent essentially their whole life. Now, after they passed away, and they didn't have anything to leave their family, their relatives, they didn't have any real estate to pass on to the next family. And so you have like this beginning of this like wealth gap, because some black people were not able to get loans. They're not able to get the best jobs. They weren't able to go to college because colleges weren't accepting them. And so a lot of black families had to forego things like owning a home or going to college. And instead they valued working, to get out of high school as soon as you can and work and support your family to the best of your ability, because you got to pay rent. And so a lot of families struggled with that, and they pass it on to their next family and the next family, and generation after generation, where you have families even today in 2021 where they've never valued college education because they've never had a chance in their family history. They've never valued owning a home. They've never valued trying to get certain specific jobs because that's just something their family has never done. It's not that there's 2021 racism going on today. It's that racism happened back in a long time ago, and it just kind of ripple effect all the way to today. And so you do have a lot of disparities today that aren't because today that there's racism going on necessarily, but that there was racism and racist policies happening that affected them then and passed on to now. And so what's the point? Why are we talking about this? Because now we have to come up with a solution. This is the problem. We can all agree that this is the problem. We don't even have to talk about critical race theory. This has nothing to do with it. This is just history. This is just stats. This is just study and research and polls and all of this stuff. This is just facts, essentially. We're not even talking about the solution yet. I think we as brothers and sisters in Christ can talk about the history of the United States. We can do this in an objective way before we even get to something deeper than that, like critical race theory. But what critical race theory does is it takes this problem and says, okay, we have a solution to the problem. Here is our solution. And that's what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to break down their solution, how it relates to this problem, and is it a good solution, or is the solution in some cases worse than the problem that we start with? So that's all I got for this video, but whenever you're ready, we'll continue on to the next video as we break down what is critical race theory.